Given the nature of the Slaughterhouse 9, it is not difficult to understand why they would have an ever-rotating roster of parahumans. As one can imagine, having a kill-on-sight order on their entire group helps a lot in, let's say, forcing them to find new recruits. Not to mention, the recruitment also came with the potential simultaneous risk of losing members, arguably making the entire process itself counterproductive. Additionally, their tendency to get into trouble didn't help either. As it were, by 2005, around 18 or so years after its founding, only 2 members of the original 9 remained, Jack Slash and Crimson. Note that going forward, I will not be retelling the details for members I've already gone through, mostly for my own convenience, but also to be less redundant. Anyway, the first new member I'll talk about is Mannequin. He was a thinker and specialized in a lot of related things, but to boil it down, he specialized in self-contained ecosystems, and more broadly, closed systems that could withstand hostile environments. Note that due to events that I'm not going to get into, how he expressed said specialization changed, leading him to get rid of his fleshy outside and putting his fleshy insides into, 9 foot tall, 2.75 meters tall, white mannequin-looking mechanical body, which, one could say, qualified him for a mover and brute rating, among others, but most notably those two. Speaking of, the potential brute rating can be linked to the following. 1. His outer shell was immune to pistol fire, and, given later details, likely also immune to most if not all forms of standard small arms fire. In fact, to support that idea, even when against special disintegration bullets, said bullets deflected off of him. 2. He was flameproof, or at the very least, resistant to the point that he could sustain damage from an incineration-based power, and stand perfectly fine in a blaze. 3. Similar to the latter, he was freeze-proof. Even when fully encased in ice, he did not seem to suffer any long-term damage. Granted, he was not encased for long. 4. Mannequin was also blast-resistant, but it's difficult to determine how much so. An example we did have involved an explosion strong enough to blast him away at a notable distance. However, outside of intense pain, Skidder was near that same explosion and was mostly okay, not seriously injured. That said, it was difficult to determine how close Skidder was to the explosion compared to Mannequin, and, to be fair, Mannequin did seem forced to disconnect his body parts to reduce damage. However, again, note that he was still nevertheless described as having barely a mark on him after the fact. Additionally, while the speed and mass may have played a part too, keep in mind that when he did seem concerned about explosives, it was when he had to dodge supersonic missiles. Other than those things, I'll also mention that he was fine after being manhandled by bitch dogs, and that even when being hit by his own blades spinning at high speeds, the blades just deflected off. Note that these blades were capable of gouging out chunks of steel and concrete. Now, Mannequin's body wasn't just durable. Besides the various things I'll get to a bit later, said durability also came with immense physical power. He could launch a car of unknown weight around 10 feet, 3 meters away, albeit he had to crouch down bumper side and be assisted by 2 additional longer arms. He could also easily tear off a car hood and tear out an engine block. However, the latter feats involved a buildup of power, then a quote-unquote explosive show of force that was then followed by a large volume of expelled steam and vapor. Mannequin was strong, but more notably impressive actions seemed to need some degree of preamble. That said, at least in the specific instance I'm pulling from, even without buildup, he still could push or throw 600 pounds or 272 kilograms or so things, a fair distance away. Okay, while I do believe that many of the following were things that came with Mannequin, his body was modular in nature, making him very versatile and adaptable. So while all I said are things he did have or could do, they may not apply to every encounter with him. Speaking of, I suppose I should begin with things I believe to be more situational and or non-standard to his quote-unquote typical loadout. Evidently, having more than 2 arms was not the norm. And more broadly, as you have likely already guessed, the variety of arms you could choose from were likely not standard either. I've already mentioned the arms that provided extra physical strength, but another notable arm was a chunkier one that contained a shotgun or a shotgun-like weapon. I assume that same arm likely could also have contained various other ranged weaponry too. Now, he has been noted to have grappling hook hands, but I am uncertain if they were something that needed to be installed beforehand or if he could transform his normal hands into grappling hooks. Regardless, his body was still by default connected via ball joints and, most importantly, chains, with said chains being very long, able to extend 6 to 7 stories. So, even if the grappling hooks did not come standard, he could likely still grapple hook around without his presumably hooked hands, albeit likely less efficiently. Outside of arms, another aspect of him that I don't think was standard was his ability to expel a colorless and scentless gas that could incapacitate and or kill within seconds to up to a few minutes. It seemed to be something he had to prepare beforehand. Interestingly, said gas and earlier noted quote-unquote steam and vapor were both biological in nature, or at least likely to be so. I'll end on his ability to repurpose the technology of other tinkers. One example being cryotech, but obviously depending on the situation what tech he could use will vary. Sometimes he may not even have any tech to pilfer in the first place. Not to mention, I said repurpose, not recreate, so the tech itself will eventually degrade on its own. Granted, I can see how something like cryotech would have some degree of overlap with his specialty, and thus be somewhat replicable or at least maintainable. Moving on to what one can normally expect from Mannequin, I'll begin with the numerous blades he kept hidden all over his body. To name some locations, 2 were telescoping ones located in his palms, there were others located in his wrists, ones located in his forearms, ones located in his toes, and many more located in various slots all across his body. Obviously, while on their own sharp, pointy objects are dangerous, remember that these are not normal blades. Additionally, the inherent nature of Mannequin allowed him to do certain things outside the realm of a normal person. One example was spinning his multi-bladed forearms like helicopter propellers. Another was balancing, moving, and fighting on his toe blades, and yet another involved him firing his blades like harpoons. To refer back to his chain arms, as much as they could be used to move around, they can also be used as weapons. Specifically, he could use that earlier mentioned power buildup to expel a great amount of forward force. A force strong enough to not only blast a vent grate off its bolts, but also embed said grate into the opposite metal wall. Alright, Mannequin was very agile, flexible, and adept at getting places inconspicuously. Since it's relevant to give some examples for the latter, the reason he was able to blast the vent away in the first place was because he was sneaking around in vents. Go figure. Which, on its own, does show an ability to navigate in tight spaces, but the thing to keep in mind is that the vent itself was located at the PRT headquarters. He not only bypassed security measures that one would expect from a government facility, he also avoided measures specifically meant to counter other tinkers. And in a somewhat similar vein, Mannequin was even skillful enough to sneak around Skitter's swarm, to the point that he could intentionally make contact with said swarm as a means to taunt Skitter. Sneaking aside, to focus back on things that may qualify him as a mover, besides the grappling hook hands I mentioned earlier, on the more mundane side of things, he could do cartwheels to dodge a variety of attacks, even bullets. Albeit said bullets were the special disintegration ones, so they may not have had the same properties as normal ones. That said, while I don't believe he did a cartwheel to do it, he did manage to narrowly dodge those earlier mentioned supersonic missiles. Focusing on his general movement speed, he has been shown to surpass the speed of bitches' dogs, which have been shown to be faster than cars. No specific speeds, but that should give you the gist of things. Now, while perhaps not needed, here are various ways Mannequin has been described to help you form a better mental image of his capabilities. First, he was able to move in every angle and change directions on the dime. Second, he was faster than any Olympic runner and more agile than any gymnast. Finally, his fingers were quote-unquote like worms, with each knuckle able to bend in impossible directions. Anyway, to get some leftover points out of the way, first, due to Tinker and Parahuman shenanigans, Mannequin was functionally immortal and functionally had quote-unquote endless energy. And from what I could discern based on that stuff, he could subsequently last many thousands of years on his own. Second, given the capabilities of his body, Mannequin had a very unique and unorthodox way of fighting. It was described as confusing and disorienting. While perhaps not quote-unquote accurate to life, one mental image I had was of Voldo from Soul Calibur. I know, what a reference. Lovely. Third, based on other pieces of information, Mannequin's outer shell was also likely composed of a selectively electrically conductive glass-like material, or perhaps a sort of composite material that was like glass or ceramics. Regardless, in concert with the chains, that conductivity helped pull his body parts back to him faster, among other things. Finally, Mannequin was a trap master. Not surprising, given all the other information, but yeah. To end weaknesses. I don't have much to say, but here's what I have. 1. Mannequin did have some, if not all, of his vital organs within him. In fact, they can, at times, be seen contained behind glass. Obviously, it's likely not quote-unquote normal glass. 2, in certain situations when he did do his, let's call them, build-up attacks, he can be momentarily put out of commission as he pulls himself back together. Similarly, and to refer back to earlier, a sufficient explosion can seemingly do much the same. 3, while hypothetical, it may be possible to quote-unquote take him out if something hard and heavy enough was focused on the small area on his body. Finally, while he was extremely resilient to many mundane means of attack, I guess, as per usual, the shenanigans of certain other parahumans can very much overcome his defenses. Okay then, Shatterbird was a shaker with mover capabilities, and to focus on the shaker part, she was a silica kinetic, though to be more accurate, she could, through the use of self-generated high-frequency sounds, manipulate silicon. As you may realize, manipulating silica on its own already posed a great danger, given its use in concrete, glass, and fiber optics. However, being able to more specifically manipulate silicon greatly increased her already impressive ability to cause destruction and havoc, in large part due to silicon's usage in electronics. In one fell swoop, she can take out most, if not all, electronics in a city. Evidently, one can imagine how much death that could cause, but compounded with most glass being broken at the same time, along with the loss of communications, Shatterbird can cause a lot of collateral death. That said, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so before we get into uses, here are some broad things to keep in mind. First, her range can fluctuate greatly, specifically when related to how far she could extend her high-frequency sounds. To not overcomplicate it, essentially her range depended on how many quote-unquote large pieces of glass there were. Let's say this. She causes one initial glass piece to resonate at her frequency, and instead of being forced to push more power into her ability to extend it, the initial glass piece will resonate with other nearby large pieces of glass, and from there her frequency will continue to expand out and shatter glass until something stops it, or until there is no longer big glass to extend it further. Second, when it comes to more direct manipulation, her fine control of glass and the like was much better the closer it was to her. Finally, her Manton limit made it so that she could not manipulate silica and silicon within organic and/or living things. Granted, the only example that I know of that confirms that is one that involves her not being able to control silica within plants. So, Okay then, uses. The obvious thing to start with was Shatterbird's tendency to scream and destroy all glass within the city, with said shattered glass becoming deadly projectiles to anyone nearby at the time of their shattering. somewhat related, but outside of quote-unquote inadvertent glass projectiles, other ways she was shown to more actively manipulate glass and such included the creation of glass storms, glass shields, blasts of sand that could cause sandburns and bruising, looping streams of glass that acted like super eroding sandblasters, and perhaps most interesting, to me at least, was using smaller pieces of glass on her body to help perform finer, more delicate and precise movements. Oh, and I'll also note that in relation to her glass shields, that she was shown able to create many, dozens to hundreds, of glass barriers. Though I was unsure if they were a bunch of thick glass windows or glass composites, or probably most likely, both. Anyway, to go back to glass on or around her body, that was where her mover aspect came from. Suffice to say, she used glass to fly around. Not in the sense of using them as platforms, though she probably could do that to some degree, but in the quote-unquote generic flying power way. I don't know much about its parameters, but what I do know is that she could fly up to 4 stories or so. She could lift at least 2 other people with her, and that when flying she was slower than Siberian and Crawler. I know, not much, and kind of poorly defined, but to help out at least a little bit. While she did still need to exert some notable effort and only had to exert herself for a fairly brief time, she did at one point manage to move one of Dragon's suits a few feet, and take it out of one building and slam it into an opposite alley wall. Note that it could have been the Melusine suit, which was around 8 feet or 2.5 meters tall and wide, but I am uncertain of that fact, so take it with a grain of salt. Alright, now, given the right circumstances, and with the latter context in mind, it may be possible that she could lift up more than 2 people. That said, I kind of doubt it since I think flying probably takes a level of finesse different from just manhandling an object or a person, but take it as you will. Now, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand it myself, but Shatterbird can use glass to help stabilize injuries. The explanation was that she created constructs to redistribute blood, and in cases of extreme blood loss, that helped prevent large quantities of blood from spilling out. More broadly, she could use this same principle to prevent injuries from worsening, or at the very least slow down a worsening injury. Keep in mind that she could not do this to make an unusable body part usable again. Her constructs were just good emergency medical care. Though, to be fair, she probably could puppeteer, let's say, a limp arm or leg, but I'd imagine it would be more effort than it was worth. I was originally going to compare all this to Scorpion from World Trigger, if you know you know, but the nature of World Trigger makes the comparison between the two unsuitable. So as it stands, think of it as a unique type of cast, splint, and or medical gauze. Moving away from that, some miscellaneous things to keep in mind is that she could control molten silicon, albeit with significantly less fine control. Additionally, while it may not be explicitly canon anymore, she could quote-unquote hear sand, or I suppose hear through sand. And apparently it was serious enough, or at least bothersome enough, that she did, allegedly, in the now missing interlude, leave Dubai because of all the digging sounds she heard. To be quick with the weaknesses. First, given her decreased capabilities with molten silicon, very intense heat, to say the least, can pose an issue for her. Granted, while less effective, she was still combat capable even with the molten silicon. Second, when related to her high frequencies, soundproofing, frequency dampening, and potentially counter frequencies were ways to fight against them. Though, third, perhaps the simplest idea was preventing her from making sounds in the first place. I don't know if it would work, but covering her mouth may work, but if it doesn't, other extreme methods that would or could work were mastering her or altogether just slitting her throat. Granted, if you manage to do the latter, one could perhaps just go for the kill, unless, you wanted to capture her for whatever reason. Anyway, the next 2 members have very little information about them in terms of exact parameters. Not to mention, certain details we do have are based on clones of them, which doesn't help since, as stated in the other Slaughterhouse video, they aren't the best examples of how said relevant members were in life. For example, Chuckles. He was a brute and a mover. The former related to super strength located in his arms and chest area, while the latter related to super speed located in the legs and how he perpetually perceived the world in slow motion. For the super strength, I'm only aware of one example, said thing being his ability to carry a young adult, an unknown cape, and someone more than 8 feet tall, 2.4 meters tall, in his arms with little difficulty. As for the super speed, he was described as being so fast that it almost seemed like he was teleporting. I suppose I will say this now, but Chuckles did not seem to have enhanced durability. So, if you can catch him, he will likely fall just as easily for the most part as a normal human. Now, to get back to the inaccuracy of clones, one clone of Chuckles had 31 elbows, allowing that Chuckles to extend and retract his arms somewhat like an accordion. It goes without saying, but original Chuckles did not have those capabilities. Okay, Winter is a little more difficult to nail down. What can be confirmed is that she was a shaker. An initial assumption that one can make was that she created and manipulated cold, that it was some sort of ice power, let's say. However, what she actually had was a dampening power. She caused objects and people to lose their quote-unquote inertia. The ambient effects she could cause with this altered the physics around her and made people lose their quote-unquote will. I am uncertain of the limits of these effects, especially given the details we do have of the power came from what we saw 2 clones of Winter do, one of which being more normal, another being a hybrid of Winter with another parahuman. The latter, from what we saw, had essentially the same capabilities as the normal clone, but to ease into things, with the hybrid clone, we know that the loss of will caused people to move slower and react slower. When it came to altering physics, she could focus her power in a small area to more significantly alter said physics to make general motion within be very slow. With the normal clone, that's where we get the mechanics of the physics altering and will loss. Suffice to say, for the former, within the affected area, molecules slowed down and the ambient temperature lowered to the point that moisture in the air froze, generating mist. This was a wide area application of it, but one can see how these effects can become more extreme with smaller and smaller areas of effect, to the point that it would seem as if motion itself had stagnated. In fact, in relation to the cold temperatures, she could focus it just a bit more to quickly, near instantly, kill bugs. For the loss of will, it wasn't just, as previously noted, slower movement and reactions. It went a bit deeper. It instilled within people a deep torpor, an invasive feeling of not feeling. Prolonged exposure would dull the mind, make the body feel heavy, and broadly make someone more and more unwilling and unable to be active, even when in the process of freezing to death. This is a bit morbid, but I'd imagine it was similar to how staying too long in the higher altitudes of Mount Everest can and would deprive someone of enough oxygen to the point that even as they freeze to death and are basically suffocating, they just become too mentally and physically incapable of saving themselves. All that said, and to shift gears, I don't really know the range of her power, how big her zone of effect could be, and just how potent her power could be. However, regardless of whether her clone selves were as capable as her original self, I can at least state that her power was potent enough to allow the original Winter to hold off around 20 or so Protectorate heroes solo. Though, to be fair, we don't have much context about the event itself, such as the heroes involved, the location, and the circumstances. In fact, the only thing I can be mostly certain about is that she likely used guns and explosives in said event, evidenced by the fact that both her original self and clone selves were noted as using a variety of firearms, and a grenade launcher. So, that's about it, and for how much of a big deal the clones sort of were, we didn't really get that much more information about certain dead Slaughterhouse members, or at least the type of information that I would like to include in these videos. Anyway, as a contrast to the previous two, the next two have a lot of information about them. Starting with Crawler, he was, or I guess depending on who you ask, it was, a changer and a brute, with both linked together and relating to body regeneration and adaptation. More specifically, he had extremely fast regeneration, being able to heal serious and otherwise fatal injuries in seconds. Not to mention, when he did heal, he would heal to become stronger and more resistant to the things that inflicted the injury. However, note that he did not heal back into a normal human shape that was just stronger and more durable. His body would actually mutate and form natural defenses and body augmentations to counter what his body deemed as a threat. As one can imagine, that led to Crawler becoming quite a creature. In fact, since I believe it is relevant, here is a long list of physical characteristics and attributes. Though this is more in general and not how he was specifically in 2005. Right, I don't exactly know how to do this, but here I go. For the things related more to durability and strength, first, Crawler had a body build somewhere between a bear and a panther. Second, he had 6 legs to help prevent imbalance. Third, along most of his body he had armor plates, with points requiring flexibility being instead covered by durable scales. Fourth, within his body he had a variety of redundant extra organs, one example being multiple hearts. Finally, his skull was 6 inches 15 centimeters thick, with all his other bones likely being similarly extra thick. Now for fights. First, embedded within those plates are 100 salted black eyes that allowed Crawler to have great situational awareness. Second, and additionally, Crawler also had an excellent ability to smell, to the point that even against a stranger that should be undetectable, he could still somewhat tell that said stranger was there, or that something was amiss. Third, he had a fanged mouth, and within said mouth he generated acidic saliva. Finally, the ends of his legs were not just, let's say, enlarged feet or something. His rear forelegs had scimitar-like claws with smaller tentacles, while his front 2 forelimbs had long fingered hands. And I suppose I should mention that Crawler was big. His chest was 10 feet deep, 3 meters deep, and his head was the size of a small car. Okay, here are some things to keep in mind in relation to his regeneration. First, Crawler was able to regenerate from Foil's power. Second, Crawler's weakness was his corona pollentia, or at least that was his most normal weakness. However, the corona was relocated to the quote-unquote most secure location. Note that this location was unknown, but that we do know that it was not located in the brain or somewhere deep within Crawler's body. Third, in one instance he regenerated hundreds of pounds of flesh in quote-unquote 1 to 2 heartbeats. Fourth, he survived losing a heart, a part of his spine, and around half of his brain, with the brain damage specifically only briefly stunning him, taking only around 2 or so seconds for said brain to come back, with him shortly coming back after. Finally, while I don't know how useful this could be, he seemed to heal from the inside going out. Now, to get more into the adaptation side of things. Obviously, based on the earlier sections, you already know that his regeneration can and did significantly alter his body. However, I want to emphasize that while it is fair that Crawler didn't care that much, or perhaps at all about it, he did not have any choice on what mutations he received. That could have been an issue earlier on, but Crawler as he is by the time of the story, or even by 2005, was just fine. So, first, I'll highlight that the adaptations are not just things that made him more durable or combat-oriented. For example, the extra legs from earlier were, as stated, meant to help with body stability. Second, outside of parahuman powers, and even including some parahuman powers, Crawler was immune or highly resistant to most forms of damage. He was immune to conventional ammunition and explosives. He could sustain damage from 50 to 100 small white phosphorus bombs, and could apparently survive a quote-unquote small nuke. I don't know what that means, but I assume that statement meant something more along the lines of a Davy Crockett nuke instead of something like Little Boy. For perspective, I think it is more likely Crawler survives something that could destroy an entire military base versus something that could level a city. Third, going back to the body, Crawler also had enhanced reflexes. Additionally, despite his size and presumably weight, Crawler was very agile and could enact very high jumps. Plus, while on the move, he could on the fly actively adjust his joints and posture to better traverse given terrain, obstacles, etc. Finally, this is more for the really curious, but the way his acid spit worked was that it was a self-replicating digestive enzyme that was suspended in a liquid that was akin to acid, but ostensibly wasn't acid itself. Okay, since it will be relevant, before moving on to weaknesses and such, I want to emphasize that as crazy as it sounds, Crawler's adaptations must be quote-unquote natural and organic. Organic nanotech being another way to put it. While it was true that Crawler would generally eventually become immune to a given type of damage, he could not adapt and overcome to things that could not be adapted to. Basically, as far as I could tell, physics-breaking parahuman powers. Examples include certain Tinker Tech, Foil's power, Scrubb's power, teleportation abilities, precognition powers and related things, and potentially psychological attacks or things that try to manipulate the mind. Outside of those weaknesses, there was the, as stated earlier, Corona, if you can find it, and due to the nature of shards and passengers, propelling Crawler into space to outside of Earth's atmosphere will prevent him from regenerating. Since shards are linked, in a manner of speaking, to Earth, his power will not work outside of Earth. While still theoretically possible, the last weakness I'll give was how you could force Crawler to adapt in a certain way. As stated earlier, since he did not have control of what adaptations he got, one could tailor his mutations into something that made him generally immobile. Evidently, this was something more useful to a quote-unquote younger Crawler, but if one is creative enough and prepared enough, I suppose you could use this same method on a more developed Crawler. Lovely. Moving on to the Siberian, or simply Siberian, she was a brute, but the nature of her power definitely qualified her as a breaker and striker too. But before we get to all that, the basic description of her power was that she was unstoppable and untouchable to quote-unquote everything. That it included all weapons and even powers. Sort of. Her unstoppable nature gave her quote-unquote virtually limitless strength, and it made it so that no matter how dense something was, she could still tear into whatever material with her claws with ease. With this in mind, Siberian had a tendency to just barge through everything as if nothing was there in the first place. This was her way of taking the shortest and most direct path. Now, that's already impressive in its own way, but it goes even further than that. Siberian could bypass Alexandria's invulnerability. More so, when Eidolon was throwing everything at her, she went straight through altered time, force fields, lightning storms, and even slapped away hyperdense projectiles that had their own gravitational fields. Later on, she could even massively damage Scion. When it came to her being untouchable, besides what Eidolon threw at her, she was immune to damage from Alexandria's punches and Legend's lasers too. She was even immune to quote-unquote less combat-oriented powers like Trickster's teleportation power and Panacea's biomanipulation. More so, she could choose what forces worked on her, and which parts of her were affected. More on that later. But perhaps more fascinating was that she could extend her invulnerability to other people and things through physical contact. For the former, she was able to extend it to 5 people, but if she wanted to move with the people, she could only extend it to 2 others instead. When it came to objects, there were multiple instances where she was able to land on various surfaces that were unstable and or weak, but since her power was extended to said surfaces, they did not collapse. Related to that, when landing from high up, she prevented pavement from shattering under her too. Right, I kind of glossed over it. But to go into some further detail on Siberian's ability to choose what influenced her, I'll start off by stating that she couldn't fly, but she could glide. She could lower the influence of inertia on her and ignore air resistance, both of which also helped make her very fast. More abstractly, that made her movement like a quote-unquote arrow loose from a bow. More specifically, via a short hop, or I suppose step, she could cross half a block, 150 feet, or around 46 meters in an instant. Now, I know someone will wonder, but while I do think it is possible, given her ability to extend her invulnerability to others, I personally don't have an example that shows her giving others the ability to ignore certain physics like her. Sure, invulnerability was kind of that already, but given how sort of limited that was, I can see the argument of her not being able to alter the physics of others, since a little more goes into that versus the simple idea of being unaffected by everything in general. After all, the simple act of being able to walk already diminished how many people she could extend her powers to. So, if any, I can see Siberian maybe, at most, being able to share her ability to ignore physics with only one other person. Well, that was fun, but here is the big spoiler. Siberian was a projection, specifically the projection of one William Manton, and since she was a projection, in the off chance that she was destroyed, she would just reform somewhere near William. Additionally, she could do things such as blink out of existence at will and teleport, in a manner of speaking, somewhere else. Note that I don't really know the parameters of that. So, on that note, weaknesses. First of all, if you knew he existed in the first place, you should probably target Manton directly. Obviously, Siberian will be in your way, but at least you have a clear goal in mind. Not to mention, to the benefit of those attacking him, Manton was ostensibly the one person Siberian could not extend her invulnerability to. Luckily because, and I say this in all seriousness, that was Manton's Manton limit. Additionally, for optimal control, Manton seemed to need to be at most around 1,000 feet, 394 meters away from her. I assume he can be further out, but he probably would have less fine control and have worse response times. In terms of other weaknesses, and despite what I've previously stated, Siberian herself can be affected by what seems to be things that manipulated space-time. The most obvious one is Foil's power, and in that case, when Foil's power made contact with Siberian, the two seemed to cancel each other out, or at the very least we know that when contacting one of Foil's projectiles that Siberian will briefly be popped out of existence. It is uncertain if Foil's power is also cancelled out though. That said, power interactions we do know that mutually cancels the other out is the one between clock blockers and Siberians. Now, while I won't get into it, other powers that may be able to influence Siberian are Vistas and Damsel of Distress, and perhaps even Scrubs and Grey Boys, among others. Okay, while not weaknesses in the same way as the others, it is still prudent to first mention that Siberian was not fully immune to gravity. While, to be more specific, for her to even walk around as she did, she had to allow gravity to affect her. So, theoretically, one could maybe catch her off guard to not beat her, but force her away briefly by making her fall or something. Second, while yes, she could very well go through most obstacles as if they were tissue paper, one could slow Siberian down by forcing her into a situation where she could only go one specific way. Lastly, and while I do consider this the most unreliable method of attack, there is something to be said that Siberian seemed to have held some level of affection for Bonesaw. So perhaps taking the latter hostage could lead somewhere. However, while I will not go into the whole song and dance, that is assuming Siberian was not just a projection puppet of Manton, and actually had some level of sapient, sentience, whatever. For all we know, the entire personality of Siberian was just one big act put on by William Manton, which is amusing in its own way. Okay, oh boy. Final member. Hatchet Face, Brute and Trump. The Brute part gave him superhuman strength and durability. For the former, he could swing an axe straight through a car, and for the latter, he could be flattened by a steamroller and be fine. The Trump part gave him an aura that nullified parryman powers. I don't know the exact range of said aura, but based on how Cherish described her fight with him, it was relatively short, but still big enough to cancel someone's power in a nearby next-door building, which funny enough allowed Cherish the time to run away from Hatchet Face. Details I can give is that his aura will not revert biokinetic alterations to their original state, and that while it will take away a tinker's intuitive knowledge of their gear, the gear itself will still work. As for weaknesses, all I can really say is that while he was durable, he probably wasn't durable to the point that all normal means of killing and harming were off the table. Besides that, and based on the fact that Cherish was able to kill him, I assume he was also vulnerable to mental attacks and the like, and well, that's all I have. Not much else to say besides yes, I know I said certain things in my last videos about focusing on other things and not really being able to justify spending time on these videos, but honestly I just really like making them. I know, probably a bad life choice, but certainly not the only bad life choice I've made, and certainly not the worst. Probably. Anyway, I don't have anything else to ramble about, so see you later.